This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at cards that use charge counters. Charge counters made their debut in Ice Age, and since then they've been utilized a lot. So much so that they're the fourth most common type of counter in Magic, with only +1/+1 counters, loyalty counters, and -1/-1 counters appearing more. They tend to show up in both lands and artifacts as a resource that can be consumed for some effect, or they determine the kind of effect a card can have. These days, charge counters are evergreen, with at least a few cards per set utilizing them. For example, in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, there are 2 cards that use charge counters, Dragon Spark Reactor and Reckoner Bank Buster. This list is actually a very stacked one. The top 6 cards on it all have more than 100 points, so we're going to be talking about some pretty impressive cards that use charge counters. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have some effect related to charge counters. There are 103 cards that meet this requirement, and in this video we'll talk about the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8, like at a Pro Tour or Mythic Championship, is worth 2 points, and a second tier top 8, like at a Magic Fest or a Magic Online Challenge, is worth 1 point. At number 10, it's Sphere of the Suns. The Sphere is a pretty nice 2-mana mana rock that enters the battlefield with 3 charge counters on it, and you can tap it to remove a charge counter to add 1 mana of any color. That's a pretty good deal for 2 mana, as it both accelerates and fixes your mana. In Block Constructed, the Sphere was played in both control and artifact-centric aggro decks. In Standard, it was primarily played in ramp and control decks, including Tezzeret Control, an artifact-centric control deck that could even animate Sphere of the Suns as a 5/5 creature. Its most frequent home, though, was Primeval Titan ramp decks, where it could help power out the powerful giant earlier in the game. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard, though it has appeared in a few decks in both Modern and Legacy, but none of them have top-8'd any significant events. At number 9, it's Tumble Magnet. This can use up its charge counters to tap down artifacts or creatures. Like Sphere of the Suns, it was played in Tezzeret control decks, but it was also pretty popular in more creature-based decks like Cawblade and Infect. Both of those decks really liked getting in for a big hit with one of their creatures, Cawblade because of powerful equipment, and Infect because creatures could be pumped to kill the opponent in a single hit. Obviously, getting a blocker out of the way was a pretty effective way to help you do those things. The Magnet has also been successful outside of Standard, gaining points in Legacy Eldrazi aggro as recently as 2020. At number 8, I've got 2 cards, Vivid Creek and Vivid Grove. There is actually a whole cycle of Vivid lands in Lorwyn, and they all have at least a few points, but these are the only 2 that had enough points to make the list. Vivid Creek is the legitimate number 8, while Vivid Grove would have been tied with Sphere of the Suns for the number 10 slot on the list. All the cards in this cycle enter the battlefield tapped with 2 charge counters, can tap for 1 colored mana, and can tap and remove a charge counter to add mana of any color. Obviously enough, these provide some pretty nice mana, especially for slower decks that don't care about them entering the battlefield tapped. They were both played a significant amount in Standard, and this was especially notable in 5-color control decks where the Vivid lands played a big role in making the deck's mana stable. At number 7, it's Tendo Icebridge. Like the Vivid lands, it can use charge counters to produce mana of any color. Unlike them, it enters the battlefield untapped, but it also only comes with a single charge counter, and it can only tap for colorless mana when not using the charge counter. Still, like the Vivid lands, it really improved the mana of decks, but it's done so in a wider variety of formats, as coming into play untapped is a pretty big upgrade. In Kamigawa Block Constructed, it played a large role in the format because it was one made up of decks with 3 or more colors, and 7 of the top 8 decks at the Kamigawa Block Pro Tour ran it. It also saw some play in Standard and Extended, but Modern has been its most frequent home, where it's been prominently featured in combo decks that play multiple colors and are really only interested in producing colored mana a single time. Bloom Titan used to be where it saw the most play, and then Krark's Clan Ironworks decks. Unfortunately for the Bridge, both of those decks were nerfed by bans, and it hasn't gained any points for a few years. At number 6, it's Blast Zone, the 3rd consecutive land to make the list, and also the newest card on it. Unlike the other charge counter lands we've looked at, Blast Zone doesn't produce mana of any color using charge counters. Instead, it can sacrifice itself and remove its charge counters to blow up each non-land permanent with a mana value equal to the number of charge counters on it. It starts with one charge counter, and you can add more by sinking mana into it. Despite being a relatively new card, it has quickly made an impact in just about every format. This is because it has a very powerful effect for a utility land, one that can completely reshape the board. In Standard, it was mostly played in Wilderness Reclamation decks because it was a good place to sink your massive amounts of mana. In other formats, it often sees play in decks that can really abuse the fact that it's a land in particular. For example, Tron and Dredge decks run the card in Modern. Tron decks can tutor it up easily, in addition to being able to produce a ton of mana to add more charge counters, and Dredge decks can combine it with Life from the Loam to rebuy it over and over again. Legacy is where it's been the most prolific, though, largely as a result of lands decks, which, as their name suggests, are really focused on abusing lands. The deck runs lots of utility lands to tutor up, and Blast Zone is a nice one to get. In that format, even with only a single charge counter, Blast Zone can nuke a large portion of the board. It's also gained a few points in Vintage Mud decks, which specialize in producing a ton of colorless mana, so it can also rapidly utilize Blast Zone. Blast Zone is going to keep gaining points, but that's true of virtually every card in front of it too, so it'll be interesting to see if it can keep up going forward. At number 5, it's Ether Vial. This 1-mana artifact gives you the option of putting a charge counter on it every upkeep. The Vial can tap to put a creature into play with a mana value equal to the number of charge counters on it. This is quite powerful because the Vial over the course of a game gives you a major mana discount, and it can also be used to put creatures into play at instant speed. It's been a really useful card in aggro decks in multiple formats since they don't need to get very many charge counters on it to do some silly things, and it allows them to add to the board even more quickly, and aggro decks are always about that. It was only played a little bit in both Block and Standard, though. It really broke out in Extended, where it was played in aggro decks like Goblins and Affinity, and it was also played in creature-based combo decks as a way to get combo pieces into play at instant speed, like Cephalid Illusionist, who could mill your whole library for you. And if you're using the Vial to put it into play, it can't be countered either. Ultimately, the success of Ether Vial was short-lived and Extended, but that's because it got banned. In other formats, the Vial is utilized by aggro decks, especially those that have heavy disruptive elements that are really sweet at instant speed, like Modern Humans, which loves putting Kitesail Freebooter or Reflector Mage into play with the Vial. It's used in a similar fashion in Legacy Death and Taxes, and in the past was also used in Legacy Goblin decks. It will keep gaining points going forward, like all the other cards in the top 6 on this list. At number 4, it's Ratchet Bomb. This little artifact can tap to gain a charge counter, and it can be tapped and sacrificed to nuke each non-land permanent with a mana value equal to the number of charge counters on the bomb. So in other words, it's a lot like Blast Zone, but in artifact form. Used correctly, the bomb can result in the game being utterly reshaped in your favor. Like the other cards at the top, this has been a card that has impacted pretty much every format at one time or another, and because it's colorless, it has shown up in a really wide variety of decks in all of those formats, at least as a sideboard card. Like Blast Zone, it's especially spicy in formats with really low mana value permanents, because it can come down and nuke a bunch of stuff with 0 to 1 charge counters. At number 3, it is Umizawas GTA. This powerful equipment gains charge counters when the creature it's equipped to does damage, and you can then cash in those charge counters for one of 3 abilities. You can use them to pump your creature, you can use them to weaken and frequently kill your opponent's creature, and you can use them to gain life. One of the nasty things about the GTA is that its controller can just sit around accumulating charge counters because they have 3 different fairly impactful effects that they can use at any time. What's more is, it doesn't actually have to be equipped to something to use those abilities, which means the player with the GTA can just attack and gain serious value from the GTA, whether or not you block. As a result of all this power, Umizawa's GTA has been a multi-format all-star, achieving success in most formats in decks that run lots of creatures, since they are necessary to power the GTA. In Block Standard and Extended, this meant it was primarily featured in a variety of aggro decks. The GTA caused Extended to be a little too homogenous, and when the Modern format was created in 2011, Umizawa's GTA was put on the preemptive ban list, and it remains there to this day, and as a result, Modern is the only format where it doesn't have any points. However, the GTA has gone on to amazing success in Legacy, where it's usually featured in decks running Stoneforge Mystic, since she can search up the powerful equipment whenever you think you might need it. The most popular homes for it have been Death and Taxes and Stoneblade. The GTA has even found some success in Vintage. It's going to continue to rack up points going forward, although it does seem that of the top 6 cards on this list, it's gaining the points the most slowly, so it may slip down a bit in the near future. At number 2, it's Chalice of the Void. This double X costed artifact enters the battlefield with the number of charge counters on it equal to X. Once in play, it automatically counters any spell with a mana value equal to the number of charge counters on it. The Chalice can be a pretty oppressive card against some decks, effectively shutting down a massive percentage of their spells, even if you're only paying 1 for X. In Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, the Chalice sees pretty heavy play, even in the main deck, because it's just that powerful. In fact, it was so oppressive in Vintage that it got restricted in the format in January of 2015. This is because it was crazy powerful there, where there are plenty of cards that cost 0 or 1 mana, and it would lock way too many decks completely out of the game on turn 1. It appears in a whole lot of Legacy and Vintage decks, either as a main deck or sideboard card. That means it has the potential to gain more points, and it does have some chance of eventually passing the number 1 card on the list, although that card is pretty active too, and that number 1 card is Engineered Explosives. It's the only card on the list to feature the Sunburst mechanic, one of the few keyword mechanics we've seen that does something with charge counters. With Sunburst, a card enters the battlefield with charge counters equal to each color of mana used to pay for it. In other words, if you pay just red mana, it has 1 charge counter, and if you pay red and black, it enters with 2 of them. So you can sort of customize how many charge counters the explosives enters with, and then you can sacrifice it to blow up all the non-land permanents that have mana value equal to the number of charge counters. That means it is the 3rd card with this effect we've seen on the list, joining Ratchet Bomb and Blast Zone. Like them, it can really devastate a board, and because you can so easily decide how many counters it gets, you can make sure it hurts your opponents more than it hurts you. Like Chalice of the Void, it's been played in virtually every format, and that's going to continue. Well, those are the 10 charge counter cards that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. And yeah, cards with charge counters have been important in shaping this game and are especially prevalent in the Eternal formats. If these powerful cards have you charged up, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that more people will see it. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the over 400 other MTG Top 10s, you should see a playlist on your screen. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.